Today, we examine the question, why is it that states, countries, nations, they rise and they fall? Okay, so let's start off with an example that you know pretty well. So this is the Warring States period. And at this point in history, there are many powerful states. Okay, so for example, the Chu, the Jiang, the Wei. Okay, and if at this point in history, and this is about 250 BCE, I ask you to figure out, using game theory, which state would unite China and become the first great empire of China. Well, there are certain metrics that you would use to figure out which state would win out, okay? So obviously, you would look at population. Okay, who has the largest population? Okay, so the question of mass. Second question that you would look at is maybe resources, right? And resources, it's basically just farmland. So you would look at basically which areas had the most rivers, okay? And so you would be like, okay, well, this area, looks very strategic, as is this area, as is this area, okay? And then you would also look at maybe technology. So basically, which state has the most scientists, which state has the most advanced literature, arts. And then from these metrics, then you could do some analysis and figure out that maybe Chu would conquer all of China at some point, okay? But at no point, using any metrics, would you assume that Qing would conquer China. And there are certain reasons why. First of all, it's in mountains, so it's pretty poor. Second of all, it's pretty far away from the rivers and trade routes. And third of all, it's pretty isolated, okay? So you could not possibly imagine that the Qing dynasty would conquer all of China. But in fact, it is the Qing that would come and conquer all of China. And not only that, but if you look at most of human history, this pattern repeats itself. If you look at a region, the strongest nation does not come out on top. It's usually the weakest, most marginalized area that will eventually come and conquer the entire territory and create an empire. Okay? So clearly, the way that we understand history, it's problematic. It's wrong. So what I want to do is propose to you a new way to understand how empires come into being. Okay, and this was actually first proposed by a Muslim scholar, historian named Ibn Khaldun. Okay, and he proposed the idea of Abbasiyya. And all this word means is basically cohesion or group solidarity. His theory is that, yes, the people in the margins, they're poorer, but because they're poorer, they're more unified. They focus more on solidarity, on working together. Whereas in the rich areas, they become too individualistic, they become too decadent, too corrupt. And ultimately, that's why it's always these tribes from the margins that eventually conquer the wealthy, civilized areas. Okay? And this is a pattern that repeats itself throughout human history all the time. So it's almost like an iron law of history. So what I want to do is show you that there are actually three metrics that you can use to measure how dynamic a society is and how likely it is to triumph in the end, okay? And these three metrics are energy, openness, and cohesion, okay? Cohesion just follows the idea of Abbasiyya, which is just to say how likely is it that these people are willing to work together? Do they see themselves as a team? Are they willing to sacrifice themselves for each other? Are they a family, okay? So that's the idea of cohesion. openness is a very important concept, and openness just means how willing are you to adapt? How much are you willing to accept your limitations and be resilient, okay? So you can think of openness as humility, as resilience. Energy just means that you're willing to work hard, you're focused, you have a clear goal, and you're motivated to achieve this goal, okay? So these three metrics tell us how dynamic a society is going to be. And using these three metrics, we can now better understand why the Qing dynasty was able to conquer all of China, okay? So the idea is that if you're rich, okay, okay, what happens often is that you have low energy. And what this means is that the elite don't want to work anymore. They rather just exploit the other people, okay? The people. And because the people are being enslaved, they're too much in debt, they have low energy as well. For them, it's not really about building a great nation. It's not really about doing a great job. It's just about getting by, okay? So, and then the idea of openness is that the elite become extremely corrupt, they become very insolent, they become very arrogant, and so they refuse to admit that they're wrong, and as a result, society becomes stagnant. It doesn't really improve. And the idea of cohesion is that because of wealth inequality, because of corruption, people are much more individualized, people are much more atomized, okay? And this allows for a new group to come in and conquer everyone. Okay, does that make sense, guys? All right, so I'm going to use, actually another example, okay? An example is the Greek city-states. And remember, the Greek city-states, it's really the height of human civilization. They gave us Homer, Plato, Thucydides, Sophocles, okay? Just basically the basis for all of Western civilization. Now, what's interesting is that for most of their history, the Greek city-states, and these are basically like these small cities, okay? There are thousands of them, and on average, there are about 1,000 people each. There are some big city-states like Athens, but even Athens is not that big. So at its height, Athens had about 50,000 people, okay? So these city-states like Athens, Thebes, Sparta, okay? These are the major ones, and there are others as well, Corinth, Argos. They're always in competition with each other, very much like the Chinese warring states as well. And again, if we were to look at the year 500 BCE, you would think that maybe Athens or Sparta would emerge as the grand unifier of the Greek city-states. And in fact, what happened was that Athens did become an empire, but then the other Greek city-states started to attack Athens, and Athens declined over time, okay? And the advantage that Athens had over everyone else was just tremendous. First of all, Athens had the greatest navy, okay? As you can see, the Aegean is primarily about who controls the seas. So Athens was able to control the trade routes in the Aegean. Therefore, it's the wealthiest city-state. It had the greatest population, it had the most innovation, it had the most strategic location, it has the most wealth. So you would just assume that Athens would come to conquer all the Greek states. But in fact, it was the Macedonians, okay, who came in and conquered all of the city-states. And at this time in history, you couldn't possibly imagine that because the Macedonians were poor, they were isolated, they were not at all cultured, they were uncivilized, okay? But again, they had energy, openness, and cohesion, and that allowed them to conquer the city-states. And what's amazing is that even after this area was unified, okay, the Macedonians would then do the impossible and go over and conquer the great Persian Empire, the first great empire in human history. It was huge. It was Egypt, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, the Zagros Mountains, Persia. It was everywhere. And in a very quick amount of time, the Macedonians, under Alexander the Great, they sailed across the Aegean, landed in a small fort, and then very quickly, in about 10 years' time, conquered the entire Persian Empire. And at this point in history, you would think that the Persian Empire, you would think that the new Macedonian Empire would be invincible. But then what happened a few decades later is the rise of the Romans. Who are the Romans? Well, at this time in history, we don't know who they are, okay? Rome is probably here somewhere, okay? But as you can see, the entire Italian peninsula is being colonized by the Greeks. And then the Romans, who are, these poor, backward, tribal people, eventually over time, they will conquer the entire Italian peninsula, and then go and conquer the Greek mainland, and then they'll go south to conquer Carthage as well. And they will create the Roman Empire. Okay, so this is a pattern that repeats itself throughout human history. The empire becomes corrupt, lazy, arrogant. And this gives opportunity for a tribal people, whether it's the Macedonians, whether it's the Jiang, whether it's the Romans, to come and conquer all of them. Okay? But now the question then is, okay, if that's true, and so let's look at more examples, okay, of this. Let's look at the Aztecs. And the Aztecs is even a more stark example. So this is about the 16th century, 15th century, okay? As you can see, the Mexican peninsula, it is divided into different warring city-states. Okay, very similar situation to the Greek city-states and the Chinese city-states. Then what's going to happen is the Aztecs are going to come in from the north. Okay, and the Aztecs are a poor tribe that's starving. Okay, so they're basically from North America. They come in because they're looking for food. And they're warrior people. So they're hired by other city-states to fight for them. Eventually they become too powerful, so they become isolated onto a marsh, okay? And this marsh, it's poor. And everyone just assumed that they would starve to death in this marsh. But what's amazing is that as a people, they became very creative. And they turn this marsh into farmland. And over time, they will slowly come to conquer everyone, okay? And they established the Aztec Empire, which rules over millions and millions. And then what happens, which is one of the greatest mysteries in human history, is you have another group of people called the conquistadors from Spain, and there's only about 500 of them, okay? Arriving about the year 1519, they come in, and in like a very short amount of time, they conquer the entire Aztec Empire. And Spain comes to rule basically all of South and Latin America, okay? So even though, yes, we have a formula in place, whichever group has the most energy, whichever group is the most open, the most cohesive, will conquer the other groups. It still doesn't explain to us how this happened, how this guy, Hernan Cortés, with 500 conquistadors, was able to come in and conquer a land of millions and millions, okay? Now, there are historical explanations, including, of course, disease. People from Spain had diseases, and the Aztecs did not have the immune system to counter these diseases. Another explanation is the Aztecs believed that these conquistadors were gods, and that's why they surrendered very quickly. Another explanation is that the conquistadors had allies, local allies, that were pissed off at the Aztecs. But again, these explanations, they sound okay, they sound like they work, but they don't actually give us the full picture of what really happened. And in game theory, what we're really trying to figure out is what happened exactly, okay? It's a game. How are the players playing the game? What are their motivations? What are their incentives? Okay, does that make sense? Okay, that's what we're trying to figure out. What actually happened in this instance? I want to look at one more example before we look into the theory of game in game theory. Okay, this is one of the early civilizations in human history. Okay, in fact, it's considered the first great civilization of human history. It is the Sumerians. And what happened was that, if you look at a world map, okay, this is a world map, right? Mesopotamia is the center of the world. Because if you want to access the rest of the world, you have to go through Mesopotamia. And if you look at Mesopotamia, the center of Mesopotamia is a place called Uruk, okay? Sorry, Uruk. Uruk. Okay, Uruk, which is here, okay? And as you can see, Uruk is the meeting place of the Euphrates and the Tigris. And if you look at this, the Uruk allows you to access the Persian Gulf, which gives you access to India, okay? Or we call the IVC, the Indus Valley Civilization. And then traders are able to take the goods and cross to Egypt, okay? And then you're able to go north to Anatolia. So why did Europe become the first great world city? Because it was the center of all global trade. So different people came together into the city in order to establish a trading post. Okay, and over time it grew and grew because it was very wealthy. Okay, and over time it set up colonies elsewhere. Okay, so it set up colonies in other places, and then eventually these different city-states came into conflict with each other, which is the same process of what happened with the Chinese warring states as well as the Greek city-states. And you would assume that one of these city-states would conquer the rest. But in fact, again, it was these tribal mercenaries from an isolated region called the Akkadians, who would come and conquer everyone else, okay, the Akkadians. Okay? And after they built the first empire, okay, then what happened is that other people would come over and conquer them as well. And then you have people from the Zagros Mountains, the Persians basically, come in and unify the entire area and create the Persian Empire. All right? So this is a pattern that emerges throughout human history. It's a pretty consistent pattern. Okay? We have theories as to why this is happening. Yes, we do know that groups that are energetic, open, and cohesive will triumph over other groups, but the idea of game theory is to figure out exactly what happened, okay?